Hello everyone, this is Sirisha and I host the Women, Career and Life podcast. Just like you, I've traversed varied paths, stumbled a little, picked myself up and learned a great deal on my journey. Many of us face similar questions, but we don't always get to have a conversation with our friends or peers. In this podcast, you will hear real stories that you can connect with on the challenges of navigating career and life. You must be wondering who I am. In my everyday life, I'm a career woman, a mom, and an avid reader. I'm also a road tripper, amateur gardener, and even a fashionista on some days. Join me and my guests as we have an open and honest discussion on career change, trade-offs, and working across boundaries. You get the idea. It's a perspective you simply may not hear anywhere else. Hello everyone, welcome to today's podcast. This is our series on health and we are talking about mental health. I have Ashley Ariel with us, who's a licensed counselor and also an eating disorder specialist. Ashley works with children and teens and families as they work through eating disorder issues and around body image issues as well. She's a passionate advocate doing outreach programs in the community and across the board with schools as well. Ashley, welcome. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you for having me.
To get started, how did you get into this field? Can you walk us through your background? What do you do currently?
Yes, I started out at Children's Health and I was in our behavioral psych unit where we were treating everything. We were treating suicidality, non-suicidal self-injury, and then that was the only place at the time to treat eating disorders. That's where I was first, exposed to treating them. That's not something that most counseling programs offer a lot of input on. You have one class perhaps on eating disorders as part of psychopathology, and then that's it. So my career started at Children's Health, and then later Children's built an entire program out in Plano. And so I'm now with Children's Medical Center Plano. We have a 12-bed unit to treat kids inpatient, and then we also have a partial hospitalization program and an IOP program where the kids go home at the end of the day, but we're still providing services for either most of the day or half of the day.
Obviously, you work in a children's hospital, but is that the demographic that is most impacted? And when do you start to see manifestations of eating disorder usually?
So most eating disorders develop in adolescence. And the tricky thing is, do you catch it in adolescence or not? So even when you have an adult presentation of an eating disorder where it's identified, let's say in your 20s or your 30s, most people can go back to sometime in their preteen or adolescent years. I will say in the past, I've been at Children's for 12 years. I have seen kids come in younger and I have seen kids as young as 7 or 8. So most of the eating disorders develop in the younger ages. And we're really lucky that we have a lot of programs now that are catching it at those younger ages before it gets to adulthood where it's very difficult to treat.
So what usually are the reasons for it? We've seen a lot of coverage in social media now about shaming body issues and just Instagram and so many pictures. I think that creates this image that people aspire to, which is not necessarily normal. So what can we do to detect that early on and intervene?
It's a great question. It's a question every parent asks us when they get there because they say, what could we have done to prevent this? What is the root cause of this? And the frustrating answer is that we're not always really sure. So we go by the biopsychosocial model. So what we would say, biologically speaking, obviously, some people have a predisposition in their family. So someone in the family may have an eating disorder, but they may not. Similar to people with a cancer diagnosis, sometimes you can trace that back in the family. Sometimes this is the first person. And so we look at biology. We also look at temperament. It can be different depending on the different diagnoses. Most of our kids are highly perfectionistic. They're very smart, they're very rule following, and they're very compliant, and they're usually fairly aware of other people's feelings, and they're very compassionate towards others, but not necessarily compassionate to themselves. Then you have their social environment. This happened to me in high school. I did not develop an eating disorder, but I had friends who spent their lunch restricting their lunch and only drinking a diet soda and talking about their weight and disparaging their bodies. So it could come from friends. Honestly, one of the reasons I am a big advocate is that I do feel, unfortunately, there are adults in kids' lives that say things. So I do know at school, I have a 7-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old daughter. My 7-year-old We've run into two instances, even at her age, where she has been told at school that food is not good for you. And she is very assertive, and she raised her hand and she said my motto, which is all food is good food. And we do say in variety and moderation, but she just raised her hand and assertively told them. So I do think just sometimes in schools, depending on athletics, it could be coaches. Sometimes it's the pediatrician. The kid goes in and the pediatrician says, hey, they need to watch their weight. And the kid hears that. Sometimes parents are dieting themselves. And then obviously social media. And the impact of COVID is something that we're continuing to study, because kids' screen time initially, when kids were home from school in the beginning of March 2020, they were on their phones a lot more as they weren't doing social activities. And so obviously, yes, they're TikTokers and influencers and YouTubers and all of these things where people are putting their diets out there, their exercise routines. So we just call it the perfect storm, that a kid may be going through a difficult time in their life, whether it's a move or they've lost a family member or they're being bullied. Then they may have some of these psychosocial stressors, and it culminates in the development of an eating disorder. And that is a very frustrating answer for most of our parents, because they really want to know what is the one thing that caused it. And we can't always give that to them. But I would say that those are the biggest factors.
It's not surprising, especially when you're talking about adolescents and teens. The peer group has a much bigger influence than the adults in their life. Mm-hmm. So they are taking their cues and learning from their friends. And now social media is their peer group as well. So there's a lot of influence coming from there. I think it's saddening and disheartening when you hear that your 7-year-old is hearing this at school. And that ties into where you said start seeing it at 8 and 9-year-olds. They're already hearing that conversation. Before we deep dive, do you see teenage girls?
Prior to COVID, Children's would have an eating disorder symposium each year where we would cover different topics. I think that what most people think of is it is an adolescent, wealthy girl, that this happens for people who maybe have the luxury of open access to food and then are just really choosing not to. And I think one of the things that I like about working at Children's, where we see all demographics, is we see males and females. I would say the highest I've seen our unit split is about 40-60, with 40% male. That's not always the case. I will say we see kids from all socioeconomic statuses. So sometimes we have kids who are food insecure, where that may have played a role in their restriction. We see kids from all religions, all ethnicities. We see kids across gender identity and sexual orientation. A lot of the times, students in their programs have to interview therapists in the field, and they will ask me, what's the typical eating disorder? And again, I say, I can't really tell you.
I think it's a disorder with no specificity. And I'm glad you're sharing that, because anyone can have it and anyone can manifest symptoms. So what are the types of eating disorders and what are the symptoms for someone to detect it?
The most common one that people seem to be familiar with, and perhaps is portrayed the most in some of the movies and the TV shows, is anorexia nervosa. You will typically see a kid restricting, and which means not eating. Now, some people think, okay, if I see my kid eat at all, I see my kid eat dinner at home, so they can't possibly have anorexia. But that kid may have skipped breakfast, because some kids don't eat breakfast. They may have then skipped their lunch at school. They may have not had a snack, gone to athletics. And then that dinner that may be not that big, but not that small, could be their only meal of the day. And they could still be dropping weight and getting to a point where it's very dangerous and they're in the hospital with us. So what anorexia is, it is a restrictive pattern of behavior. So where someone is not intaking enough calories to support their weight, they are losing weight. It used to, the DSM is how we do all of the disorders. And so there was a change made in the 5th edition. It used to say you had to be under 85% of your ideal body weight. So whatever the weight for your gender, age, and height that you should be, you had to be under 85% of that. They have taken that off, and I think that's really important. But it is basically that you are under your expected weight or you have dropped weight. For kids who are gaining and growing, like my 7-year-old should be gaining every year and growing. Anorexia nervosa in a younger kid could look like they haven't lost weight, but they have failed to gain in a year, which would be troublesome. Or it could look like someone has begun to lose weight and is now underweight. it has to come with a preoccupation with weight and shape. So there has to be this drive for thinness, or this drive for, sometimes with the males, it's not necessarily a drive for thinness, but it's a drive for a certain body aesthetic. So it could be that they quote unquote want to look muscular. So we would still call that a drive for thinness, even though that maybe like waif-like model body isn't what they're after. And it usually comes with body distortions where the person, as they are losing weight or failing to gain and grow, they do not see themselves as underweight. They see themselves as either an average weight or sometimes see themselves as overweight. So for anorexia nervosa, that is the primary presentation. But then bulimia nervosa is where you're seeing kids who sometimes they're underweight, but most of the time their average weight could possibly be overweight. Those are the kids that are going through patterns of binge eating and purging behaviors. And so they're eating more than what we would consider a normal amount of food in a specific amount of time. So stereotypically, again, in the movies, it's like they ate a tub of ice cream or they ate a whole bag of chips. The interesting thing that a lot of the anti-diet dietitians, who there's a ton of them that I could tell you about, they're coming out and they're using social media positively. They're using TikTok and Instagram positively to say, hey, most people who are binge eating, actually that binge eating oftentimes follows restriction. So kids will try to restrict and restrict. Your body's built to override that and get food into you. And so some kids can't go through that restriction and will flip into the binge eating. Then they will feel guilty and they will purge. Purging could be emesis. It could be use of laxatives. It could be use of diuretics, or it could be the kids who binge eat and then they will run or exercise for an hour to get those calories off. And so those kids, it can be very dangerous. I think most people focus on anorexia nervosa because their weight is so low. For the kids with bulimia nervosa, their electrolyte levels are often very off. And that can be very dangerous. All of us know potassium, phosphorus, magnesium. When you're purging, those things can be very off and it can be very life-threatening. We have a diagnosis called otherwise specified feeding and eating disorder, where you have symptoms of anorexia or bulimia, but you're not meeting maybe like the clinical criteria. So sometimes we see kids come in who are not quite at the threshold for that diagnosis. And so it's otherwise specified feeding and eating disorder. And then the other thing we treat that I think people are not as familiar with is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. We do have, I would say, when we have the really young kids, most of the time that's the diagnosis, although I have seen young kids with what we would call a traditional eating disorder. So ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, is not weight or shape driven. Those kids do not have concerns about calories. They are not worried about any of that. What they have had is either a traumatic event. So they may have choked and now be afraid to eat certain foods. We've had kids that they had the flu, they threw up. Now they're terrified of throwing up. They don't want to intake food. We have kids who have medical conditions. They may have GI issues. They may have severe food allergies, and now they're afraid to eat because it causes them pain, or they could have an anaphylactic reaction. A bunch of different ways that you could get to ARFID, but the key component is that they have a restrictive pattern of eating that is impacting their kind of normal weight and growth trajectory, or they have lost weight, but there are no body distortions and no drive for thinness. Then there is binge eating disorder. Children's does not treat that. That is not my specialty, but that is where people have binge eating, but they do not have any purging behaviors.
So what, as parents, family members, community surrounding these children or teenagers, what can we do? What are the signs we would look for, and how do we intervene?
Before, I could answer as a professional. Now that I'm a mom, I'm recognizing a lot of ways you can intervene. I always tell this story. So when my daughter was in kindergarten, she was in virtual kindergarten, and the PE teacher had to send home for these activities. And one of them was you need to karate squat good foods, and you need to karate chop bad foods. And my daughter, let me tell you, my family knows the only F word in our family is fat, right? And so she said, wait, Mom, they're saying chicken nuggets are bad food. They're saying pizza is bad food. No food is bad food. All food is good food for your body. And I said, yes. And so I cut off the video. I said, we're not doing this. I emailed the coach And I said, if there is any kind of nutrition advice that's coming towards my child, she will not be participating in that. That is reserved for licensed dietitians, registered dietitians. And the coach was, very nice and understanding when I explained my specialty. Again, with this other comment, I think for parents, when you begin to hear those things at whatever age, you may hear them. My daughter's very young. You may not hear them later. I think you can just talk to your kid very openly. And some of these things it's not an eating disorder, right? There are kids who in adolescence are like, maybe I'm not eating a dessert 3 times a day. Is that unhealthy? No, but I think you do have to watch those trends, because what I hear a lot from parents is, my kid decided to be healthier and they cut out desserts. And parents are like, okay, that's fine. Do I want my kids having sugar at 7:30 right before bed? No, I don't. But we also don't, there's no food that's off limit in our house. It starts with desserts, and then kids will move into, okay, I'm not going to have chips. I'm not going to have fast food. I'm never eating fried food. There's no more pizza. So I would just keep an ear out, and do some kids maybe change their food intake, and it's not dangerous. But I think parents, usually I would say there is a warning bell, and it's hard to train yourself to look out for it, because one thing I'm very passionate about is our society has really, I think, demonized and weaponized food. I think everybody has something that is wrong with food, and people are making a lot of money off of TikTok. And I'm not going to call out any store chain in particular. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy organic food. But again, there are billions of dollars in the health and wellness industry being made by labeling foods as clean or dirty or safe or unsafe. And it's also, and one of the things I'm really passionate about, it's an equity issue. So they're demonizing foods that some families need, because that may be all they have access to. Or if you're a single working mother, you may have to stop by Chick-fil-A, and that's the only thing you can get your kid. And fast food doesn't have to be bad food. So I would look out for that. I would look out for kids skipping meals, obviously. I would look out for kids exercising more than you would expect. So for instance, a kid who has soccer practice, I played soccer my whole life. I did not have energy to go running after I had already spent an hour and a half at soccer. So we have parents who have said they had track practice, but then they're still out running, or then they're still doing crunches, or they get really upset if they miss one day of working out. If you have a kid who's working out and they're injured, but they're so worried about getting out of shape that they're pushing their injury, that's also something. And because we're in Texas, and Texas is a very sports focused state, I think we do see that come up. Wearing really baggy clothes. Kids, ironically, that lose this weight don't want anybody to see it. They are satisfied by seeing it, but they want to hide it from people. And I know sometimes the style's going away from these oversized extra large t-shirts and leggings, but if you see your kid wearing baggy clothing or layers in the summer, these kids are cold because they don't have body fat. And so they'll be wearing a sweatshirt in like June when it's 90 degrees outside. So I would say those things. And then one of the things I think in mental health, we've always talked about, family meals are so important. They're actually really protective against a variety of different mental health disorders. And so if you're having family meals, just paying attention to, is your kid eating or just pushing their food around? If you see maybe some of these other signs, just start to pay attention to what they're doing.
Don't forget to subscribe to my Substack newsletter. The links are in the show notes. If you're looking to partner with me for keynote speaking on women leadership, financial independence, or graduate school and beyond, check out my website and reach out to me. Stay tuned in and listen to the rest of the podcast. Thanks for listening. I think it's very subtle signals sometimes. You have to be aware, you have to be cognizant, and it's a slow change or a slow drift in the conversation. So you're talking about what the kids are saying, but as parents, you made this comment, all food is good food, and how we address it, how we talk about ourselves, how we talk about our own eating habits. What do we do at home? How should we be talking about ourselves or our conversation and our relationship with food as well?
I think that, and this is the question I get from parents the most, what can I do now? And so as a woman, I think everyone, 38 now, And I would say my metabolism changed at about 35. I think that we just have to be really kind to our bodies. I do not disparage my body. If I have gained weight, I'm not going to talk about that in front of my kids. If maybe I'm going to eat, I'm Italian. I love food. I've never had an eating disorder. And I really do try to live by the motto, all food is good food. I do recognize as we are not teenagers, we are not gaining and growing. We have different caloric needs than our kids, right? So there are certain things. My kids can have an ice cream every single day after school. I really don't call attention to that. I don't say I can't have this or I'm not going to. Or when I do workouts at home during COVID, I have a weight routine and they said, why are you doing that? I said, well, I have to be strong enough to pick you up. One of my daughters, we were in Santa Fe. She caught her knee on a cactus. And so I had to carry her down a mountain. So I say, remember the time mommy had to carry you back down the mountain when we were hiking? I have to be strong. So I don't focus on weight loss. I focus on strength. And I want my body to live a long time. And I want my body, to be able to do the things that I like to do. I do play soccer at 30, and I don't play soccer to manage my weight. I play soccer because it's very fun and I enjoy it, something my kids play. So I focus on any activity isn't about punishment for eating this or, oh, Thanksgiving, so now I better work out tomorrow. I stay away from tying food to exercise. I stay away from any disparaging remark about my body. I definitely do not comment on their bodies. And then I think my kids, we talk about protein is to build your muscles. Carbohydrates are for your brain. There's vitamins in fruits and vegetables that your body needs. And then dairy is for your bones to make your bones really strong. You can only store calcium until age 30. That's a very big, important thing for bone health is to get in those dairies. And so that's how we talk about foods. Even at the hospital, we call them meats, milks, grains, fruits, and vegetables. So when I talk to my kids, if they're trying to eat a cookie after they've already had cookies and then they've already had maybe spaghetti, I'll say, hey, you need some protein. And so I don't talk to them about healthy or unhealthy. I really tell them we have to eat out of all of those 5 food groups in the day because they each have something your body needs. And I will tell you, even my 4-year-old understands that. I don't think you can do any damage by talking about these 5 food groups and all food is good food. I don't think kids are going to binge eat ice cream because you say all food is good food. The caveat for older kids is in variety and moderation. I think we all know we can't eat McDonald's every day of the week, but I will tell you, we have pizza night every Friday. And no one in our family is overweight from that. And so I think we have to destigmatize what society says is if you eat, this will drastically impact your weight. That's not true. And we have really good dietitians who work with families on these food myths. And a lot of families do have a lot of anxiety about the way that we're weight restoring their kids in treatment and the types of foods we're exposing them to. And based on the anxiety I have seen in the families, I recognize that this is a problem in our society. There's a dietitian I follow. Her name is dietitian Anna. And she says our body is our earth suit. It's the only body we will get. So for people who are worried about, protecting the earth, like this earth is the only earth we have, right? We need to treat it kindly. Same thing for your body. Your body is the only body that you have. And if you don't treat it with kindness or respect, you can't get another one. And so I really think that the kids that I counsel, that resonates with them, that it is the only form they're going to have, and being kind to it is very important.
Two things come to mind when you're saying this. Kids are also well aware of having a whole plate, like the 5 food groups you're talking about, because there have been times when I've gone out, especially during vacation, of my kids to start the dessert. For some reason, they don't seem to still want to start with dessert or ice cream at the meal and rather have dinner first. But that's a choice they make, right? It's not restrictive as you speak.
My daughter loves vegetables. She loves carrot sticks, and we've offered ranch for the carrot sticks. She eats them plain. I personally don't understand that. She also eats a wide variety of other things, so I'm not very worried about it. But if her snack, she chose carrot sticks, that's great. Kids may move towards dessert, salty or sweet food. And I think as long as it's not that food, they're not associating it with something negative and saying, I don't want dessert because this, but they just maybe don't want something sweet. I think that's fine. And it is. And they get to make those choices as long as they're at a healthy weight.
Yes. The other comment you made was about the earth suit. In one of these forwards, I saw this comment, which actually ties it well for someone who's a numbers person. If your body was number one and you added all the zeros after it, be it wealth, be it education, be it everything that you're trying to aspire to, you can remove all those zeros and still have the one. But if you remove the one, the zeros have no meaning at all. So it's a different
Exactly.
relation. You get one body and you have to take care of it.
I would almost say nothing matters if you don't. We talk to kids about this. If you're in eating disorder treatment because we're trying to save your life, how are you going to college? How are you hanging out with your friends? How are you going to prom with your boyfriend? If you're a parent, how are you taking care of your kids? Because you may, end up being in treatment and away from them. Or we've had people who have lost a kid, teenagers have lost their jobs, but I work with other clinicians who work with adults. They have lost their jobs because they were in treatment and absent for so long. So I agree with you. This thing will steal everything. And I think that the biggest misconception that I have seen is that the teenagers that we have, and I've treated a couple of adults in private practice before children's, they really think that they can control the eating disorder and that they can have just enough restrictive eating or just enough binging and purging that it won't get in the way of their life. And that is not the case. It will eventually overtake the person. There is no middle ground with the eating disorder.
When you practice children's, you're working with the whole family. I, as an individual, might have an eating disorder, but it's really a family dynamic that sets it up. And I think it goes to everything you've been talking about, right? The dinner table conversations, how you talk about yourself, how you treat yourself. What is that intervention that families do? And I'm also very interested in learning. We're talking about young children and teenagers. They have siblings. So what impact does it have on the siblings in specific? And how can we have that conversation with them? Because they're much closer in age, much closer to them, right? It's a different relationship between a parent and a child and a sibling and a child.
One of the biggest things that we say to the parents when they come in, because a lot of the times they're like, what did I do? And we work really hard to say, you didn't do anything. Again, there's social media, there's friends, or if a parent did go on a diet and did lose weight, there are people whose parents dieted their whole lives that don't have eating disorders. So we try really to shift them from like a blame of themselves or others and into, hey, you are our biggest source of support as we restore healing. Pediatrics for adolescents and younger kids, family-based treatment where the family is part of treatment and we do family therapy. That is the gold standard of care, in addition to what we call multidisciplinary team, meaning there's a therapist, dietitian, nurses, doctors, everybody's working together. Family therapy is structured so that parents can learn about the eating disorder, because I don't see a lot of parents that are coming in with a lot of knowledge. It's a lot about helping parents set limits on the eating disorder. So parents have become very afraid of upsetting their child because these kids who before had been very compliant, very rule following, are all of a sudden lying. They may be yelling, they may be hiding food or throwing food. And so the parents come in and think, okay, if I push on the kid at all, I'm setting them back. And we really have to coach parents that no, we've got to nip this in the bud. We've got to get on top of this. We have to make sure that the limits are there. The biggest thing with eating disorders, we do not threaten or bribe or guilt or negotiate. For our program specifically, we have expectations of the patient for how many meals they need to be eating. And if they eat them, that's great. They get certain privileges that they want. And if they're not eating and they're not nourishing their body, they're not getting certain privileges. And so sometimes the kids come back and they say, you're punishing me, for having this disorder. But I tell them, what if I didn't show up at work for 2 weeks? Like I didn't tell my manager, didn't show up, didn't do my job. Would it be punishment that I didn't get my paycheck? Or did I make the decision to not show it? No one can make me go to work. No one can force me out of my house every day to work. I make that decision because I have chosen to have a job and I have chosen to get a paycheck. If I cease to do those things, I won't get those other things. And so we teach the kids a lot that, hey, we're removing the stress, because a lot of times parents they're desperate. They are scared. Can you imagine? This is a life-threatening disorder. Parents have said, I'll buy you a ticket to New York if you eat. We'll go on a cruise, or it could be something smaller like a board game or a video game. Or they have guilted their kid. There's kids starving in other countries, or they've yelled at their kids in moments of stress and frustration. I think every parent probably has raised their voice at their kid. I have, but none of those strategies work. The kid really has to decide to make this decision. However, I tell parents, so if your kid was feeling out of school, there may be some natural consequences, right? They may have to go to tutoring, or they may have to go to summer school, or you may not let them go to all of their extracurricular activities if they have Fs in every subject. Even sports teams, you can't play if you don't have certain grades. So there are natural consequences, and we do have families enforce those natural consequences. When a kid is not eating and doing what they need to do, there will be either privileges they get or privileges that they don't get, or natural consequences. And building the distress tolerance in the family so that the family can handle that pushback from the eating disorder. Externalizing the eating disorder is something else we do. We talk about there's your kid and there's the eating disorder. We don't think that there's some sort of split personality, but for most of our kids, there's a clear timeline where the family says, I know when this eating disorder started and the behaviors changed. My kid was never screaming at me about food before. My kid wasn't lying to me before that. And so we'll say, hey, parents, you can be very mad at the eating disorder. You can be so frustrated. We're going to choose to externalize that so that you can talk about your frustration with the eating disorder without the kid feeling like you were mad specifically at them, because we do understand that this is a mental illness, and this is not something that kids just voluntarily are choosing to do in order to be defiant. It very much feels outside of their control until they can get the support to overcome it. And we talk with parents. One of the phrases I always say to parents, you can't do this for them, but they can't do it without you. And the parents also are a source of encouragement and motivation and helping the kids cope when they see their kid distressed, being able to come in and provide either encouragement, comfort. Parents then learn about their coping skills and will practice coping skills with their child. And then we also talk about the family dynamics. Are there disruptions or barriers to treatment? Has the family gotten away from communicating? Is there, to your point about siblings, is there another sibling who maybe needs a lot of attention in the family, and this kid has gotten used to not asking parents for some? Is there conflict between parents, or is there conflict between siblings where that is creating more stress for the kid with the eating disorder? Yes, we want to address that and decrease the stress in the house. I could probably talk forever, but that's basically what we're doing. Is we are educating the family. We're identifying barriers at home to recovery and identifying stressors. And then we are very much building up parents in their knowledge and teaching them all of the skills that we as a program have, so that when the kid leaves the program, we don't want them dependent on us. We want them going out and being successful after they leave us.
I think it's a perception change, right? For anyone listening to this or learning about it. Eating disorders, we very much think of it as a body and body issues, but to your point, it's also mental health issue. It's not really so much just a physical appearance thing, but really that part of it. And families, it is a stressor for everyone going through this experience. So how do we learn to cope with it, get knowledge around it, and learn to share that as well? And even when there are families going through this, they are going to have meetings with friends, go for Thanksgiving with their family. So making everyone else in your community around you aware of it, so that you can still have that conversation when not, and talk about food and others. Say you're visiting your grandparents, or you're visiting your aunts and uncles, or this friend's family. So how do you have that conversation around that? And just normalizing it in a way. And the other part of it that I thought you were mentioning is just, as a parent, you do feel the guilt, you feel that blame. And I'm glad you addressed that, because parenting is challenging and you're always questioning yourself whether you made the right thing, especially when you denied something or when you went through a certain thing. So it's hard enough to do without having that guilt and blame, because you have to separate that from what you are going through at this point, because you have to help your child enable the change, and as a family unit come together to figure out how to do it. And I think the sibling part, I also was wondering the other way. As the person is going through an eating disorder, sometimes the other sibling might also get less attention, but how to make sure that they are part of it, because that is also a stressor for another child. So going through any other incident or trauma, that they can themselves itself feel marginalized, that they should somehow be included in this discussion and just other things, and have a say in everything we're going through.
Yes. And I feel like every conversation I have, I feel like I have to talk about COVID, and I'm ready for when it's safe for us to be able to relax some of the restrictions that we have. Children's has a 2 visitor policy right now because we treat medically fragile kids both on the eating disorder unit and in other areas. So siblings haven't been allowed. Before COVID, we would have siblings in family therapy. And I've had parents who have really wanted the siblings in for exactly the reason that you said, where they have said, this has impacted all of us. The siblings very worried. We're worried they might develop an eating disorder. They're worried they're going to trigger their sibling by saying something as simple as, oh, I went to soccer practice today. The eating disorder hears that and is, why do they get to exercise and I don't? I've also had parents that said, I don't want my 9 or 10-year-old in because I don't think they understand. And I always tell them, I think that they do. They have a high capability to understand, and they've also been seeing the behaviors. And so I would like for them to be here because they have observed what's going on at home. And I bet they know more than you think they do. And so that has been one of the downfalls of COVID, is the sibling component. I do think, though, that we have tried really hard to have parents have those conversations with their kids and bring their kids into the loop. And also to explain, the biggest thing is that siblings are not responsible for the child who has the eating disorder. And sometimes kids feel that they need to follow their sibling around the house and make sure they're not exercising or purging. Or sometimes parents mistakenly think maybe an older sibling that's 15, 16 is the one who can make sure that the child eats. And I say, no, I really don't want kids in a parent role. I want to make sure that they understand that they are still in a sibling role. They can support. There's lots of age appropriate ways for them to support their brother or sister, but they do not have to be in a parent role of supervising. And I do think that's very helpful. Those conversations are very helpful for the siblings. And then we refer them to outpatient family therapy after treatment. And I tell the parents, this is like crisis time, partials or inpatient. Your outpatient family therapist will be addressing how this stay and this treatment has impacted the whole family and what steps going forward need to be addressed. So to your point, how siblings are feeling and how it's changed the family system, how it's changed the family dynamics. At the outpatient level of care, we recommend 3 to 6 months of family therapy to address all of these changes and how the family is functioning in this new model and in this new way, and to identify if maybe there has been a negative impact, like you said, where siblings feel left out or they feel like they don't have enough time with parents.
So that's right. Children's obviously here in Plano has a dedicated program, right? But people around the world, you don't have access to resources. You may not know where to go. If you figured out that you need the help, what is the best way to get access to resources? Is there like a helpline? I was watching in February, there's actually a National Eating Disorder Awareness Week. Is there helplines for other things? Is there a way to access resources?
So you're talking about NEDA, which is the National Eating Disorder Association. So they have actually parent booklets on their website, or toolkits. They have parent toolkits, what to look out for. It even goes through, if your kid's getting hospitalized, how do you talk to insurance? How do you get them in? It's great. They also have teacher toolkits. I have had teachers and coaches reach out to me before where we've come to speak to the school. But again, if you're someone, you don't live in DFW and you want those resources, there are other resources on NEDA for people that may be in a kid's life that are not there. I am part of IADEP, the International Association for Eating Disorder Professionals. And so there is a place where you can search for people who are what we call SED certified, which is Certified Eating Disorder Specialist. I'm also a Certified Eating Disorder Specialist Supervisor. And so you can search on their Psychology Today. You can usually type in eating disorder specialty to get resources for therapists. And then there is another one, and it's called the Texas Eating Disorder Association. It used to be called the ELISA Project, but it's now called Texas Eating Disorder Association. So if you're in the state of Texas, they have a lot of very good resources. I will put out a plug. We are not the only eating disorder place in DFW, and there are national eating disorder places. So for instance, Eating Recovery Center is also in Plano. They treat kids and adults. Center for Discovery is also in Plano. They treat adolescents and adults. So if you're in a different state, there are other national places that are specific eating disorder programs. Ours is in a children's hospital, embedded in a children's hospital. They have residential levels of care where people can go for up to 3 months. And then they usually do have inpatient, partial, and IOP programs as well. And so I would never deter someone from seeking those resources. I think we all have a passion for treating this disorder. I think because we're a hospital, we get a lot of very medically complex kids. And when we are full, we refer out to those facilities.
And we spend a lot of time talking about kids, but you also refer to adults. So what should adults be doing differently? What kind of treatment? How can we help them?
Adults are a little bit trickier because kids, they don't have the ability to say, I'm not going to treatment. They maybe could protest, but the parent ultimately is able to sign them into treatment. I think the biggest thing is to still involve the family. So whether it's a college age kid, parents may still have some leverage. They may still be financially supporting that kid. For adults that are married, the spouses are included. They still will do family therapy. The research on it is a little bit different. It may not be quote unquote evidence-based, treatment, but including the family and the spouse is always important. And sometimes the children. I would say if you see signs of an eating disorder, my recommendation is to see your pediatrician and possibly a dietitian. The pediatrician will usually say, hey, yes, this is concerning, and then refer you to a dietitian to monitor the weight. Those are the people who really need to build the meal plan and be the ones in charge of that. Therapists do not do that. And even our physicians on unit, they're not the ones building the meal plan. It's the dietitian. And then also, of course, I would say see a therapist, bare minimum therapist and dietitian. For adults, I would say the same thing. You could start with an outpatient therapist and a dietitian to monitor your weight and make sure it's safe. And then those people will normally recognize if a step up in level of care is needed, where with all the outpatient intervention, it's still not enough. And if the person isn't safe, they will then refer them to a facility and help you get connected. Most everyone I know that works in this field is very aware of resources because it's such a dangerous disease.
Actually, this is a very important topic. There's so much to talk about. And I'm sure if we spend time, we could talk about the types of treatment and inpatient and outpatient therapy and other treatments available as we discuss it. Is there anything else you wanted to share before I ask you the final two questions?
My biggest thing would be don't be afraid to talk to your kid. As part of treating eating disorders, we do treat a lot of kids who have suicidal ideation or non-suicidal self-injury. And in the education for those things, the biggest thing is don't be afraid to ask your kid. If you think your kid's having thoughts of suicide or self-harm, you cannot hurt them by asking. And I would say the exact same thing for eating disorders. You are not going to do something wrong by expressing your concern. I do think you should go, gently but straight at it and be very clear about what you've noticed and what your concerns are. I think to be very patient and to be very empathic, but to address it. And for parents to know it is something that can escalate very quickly. So it's not something that we want to wait on. The disease will usually progress slowly, but then once it gets going, it's like a snowball downhill. And so I think parents, oftentimes I hear them say, I wish I had done something earlier. I didn't anticipate it going south this quickly. And so just not to be afraid. I think in general, as a mental health clinician, I think we're really good at talking about medical issues, but we're not very good at talking about mental health. People get really squirmy about it and uncomfortable. And so my biggest advice would be to try to put yourself in a good space to be as comfortable as you can be, and just to be very open about anything related to mental health. And that as calm as you're able to be, that also helps others. If they need to disclose something to you, they'll be able to do that if they feel like it's a non-judgmental and safe space.
That's very important. Like you said, we do feel squirmy talking about mental health and asking if someone is going through an eating disorder issue or having suicidal tendencies or ideation. We hesitate to discuss it or bring it up because we think that will generate the idea or generate the thought. But what you're saying is that is not going to be the trigger. You're just going to speak to it to find out if there's some thoughts going on so you can catch it early or nip it, like you said earlier on, to intervene before it starts to escalate very fast or out of control at that point.
Yeah.
So this is a question I ask all my guests. What advice would you give your 21-year-old self for your career and life?
Perseverance. Most people run into something. I remember mine was grad school is fine, but there's these 3,000 hours you have to get after becoming a counselor. And sometimes it's harder to get those. I remember doubting myself a lot, and I wish I had and I did persevere because here I am, but I think just maybe confidence that it will, if you love something, keep your confidence that there's a reason that you started the process and follow it out to the end. Don't jump ship when it gets hard. Persevere through it, because I have a career now that we love what we do. We love our coworkers. We are passionate about the care that we give. And I would hate to think that I could have missed out on this just because it was hard for a few years. Like confidence in your dreams. Like, I know that sounds like very cliche, but keep going even when it's hard. If your gut intuition tells you this is the thing you're supposed to do, not if you can always defer your career, but that inner knowing, follow that inner knowing that's telling you this is what you're called to, and just keep pushing through.
You're saying believe in yourself and follow your inner compass, because there are other things to be had, like the relationships, the community, the outreach, just the impact you're having. You did it for yourself, but you are having this huge impact now in what you're doing. And even this discussion we are having, I'm learning from it. Hopefully others will get to hear and listen and help themselves and others as well, and just spread the message. What is the one word you would use to describe yourself?
That's actually very hard to boil that down into one word. And I would say bold, probably.
I can totally see that from what I know of you, which is good. So thank you, Ashley. This was very informative, and I'm so glad we got to talk about this, because I have only read a little bit. There's a lot of discussion around it. And the most important thing that I took away from this conversation, a couple of things, is it is not just a physical manifestation, but really a mental health issue. And it's separate from the identity of the person, and how you as a community or family can support the discussion that we are having to enable them to address it. And just talking about it early on, like we talked about it, right? And directly asking them is better than thinking that's going to be the seed of an idea for them to go down that path. If they're thinking about it, they've already thought about it. There's nothing you, by asking, you're going to change that. You might as well address it and have treatment go through early. So I'm so glad we got to chat with you and share your immense knowledge. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate opportunities like this. I think that this is such a delicate subject that I hear parents all the time say, I wish there were more resources. And so I think when people like you invite people like me to discuss this, and you're reaching a wider audience than I'm reaching in the hospital, I'm just really grateful for that.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Tune in every other Wednesday to catch the next episode. If you think a friend may benefit from this, please share this podcast with them. Please like, subscribe, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. All the resources we talked about are also available on my website, womencareerandlife.com. I would love to hear from you about your stories and your journey. You can reach me on my blog, Twitter, Instagram, or Gmail at Women, Career and Life. Until next time, this is Sirisha signing off. Remember, there are infinite possibilities to drive change in career and life. Which will you choose to make a reality today?